You're in a dungeon. It's dark, dramatic, and most likely it smells awful. Your party barely survives the boss fight. Someone almost dies and everyone's exhausted. And then you find it. A massive hall filled with gold. Not a chest, not a pouch, a literal room of coins, jewels, and artifacts. The kind of wealth that would fund an entire kingdom. So you load out what you can carry, stumble back into daylight, already planning your early retirement. And then, nothing happens. No price spikes, no guards following you, no noble asking uncomfortable questions, no officials wondering why 4 random people just injected more gold into the local economy than the entire region produces in a decade. The money just works, shops accept it, the world keeps going. That one dungeon should have broken everything. And that's the problem. But surprisingly, it's still the smallest problem I have with fantasy economies. Well, fantasy economies aren't weird because gold is infinite or because magic exists. They're weird because they pretend massive wealth shocks don't exist at all. Once you start paying attention, you see it everywhere. Dragons sitting on hoards that could destabilize entire continents. Ancient ruins functioning like fully stocked vaults for anyone brave enough to walk in. Artifacts worth entire cities traded like their mana rewards for side quests. And yet, outside the dungeon entrance, the world stays perfectly stable. That's not because its economies are broken, it's because they don't really react. In the real world, economies react violently to shocks. A new gold mine doesn't just make a few people rich, it changes labor flows, settlement patterns, power structures, and politics. A war doesn't just destroy things, it restructures who controls production, who owes debt, and who gets to rebuild. Even relatively small technological changes can collapse entire industries or create new elites almost overnight. You've seen it happen all the time. Fantasy worlds casually introduce wealth shocks orders of magnitudes larger than that, and then move on like nothing happened. That only works if the economy is effectively frozen in place. And nowhere is this more obvious than with adventurers. But adventurers wouldn't even be the biggest issue of a realistic fantasy economy. They're just the first thing that makes the cracks visible. If you remove dungeon loops entirely, most fantasy economies would still feel wrong for reasons that only really exist in fantasy. But more about that later. Adventurers matter because they show us how fantasy treats effort, reward, and value. A farmer produces value slowly, tied to land, weather, and time. An adventurer produces value in sudden spikes by surviving violence. That alone should already tilt society towards risk-taking elites. You can see this clearly in something like Goblin Slayer, where monster hunting becomes a parallel labor market. Or in The Witcher, where killing the right creature once can pay more than months of honest work. But the actual weirdness starts when you look at how magic changes labor itself. This is the part fantasy almost always underplays. Because if you actually follow it through, it stops being a background detail and starts taking over the world. In most fantasy settings, magic is not rare in the sense that it only exists once in a century. It's rare socially, but functionally it's everywhere. Kingdoms rely on court mages, armies rely on battle mages. Cities rely on magical infrastructure, even if the story doesn't call it that way. But fantasy rarely shows the actual effects magic would have on everyday life, and more importantly, on labor. When one mage can irrigate land during a drought, move stone that would take hundreds of workers, heal injuries that would otherwise permanently cripple laborers, or preserve food that would otherwise rot, that mage isn't a specialist anymore. They are a replacement for entire segments of the workforce. Over time, that kind of capability doesn't just help society, it changes who society actually needs. You can see these implications clearly in Freerun. Early on, spells feel legendary. Later, they are treated like household tools. Magic for cleaning, repairing, measuring, transporting, locating object, and even trivial comforts become normal. That implies a world where vast amounts of manual and service labor should simply shrink. In Harry Potter, teenagers with minimal training can duplicate objects, repair buildings instantly, and move goods without physical effort. In many Final Fantasy worlds, magic replaced medicine, construction, transport, or even energy production all at once. In a realistic economy, that kind of productivity gap doesn't remain socially neutral. Wages collapse in non-magical labor. Physical skills stop being a path to stability. The real divide becomes access to magical education, mentors, and institutions. If you can't use magic, you become structurally unnecessary. Fantasy worlds almost never allow this to happen. Mages are powerful enough to save cities, but some are not powerful enough to make farmhands redundant. Healing magic exists, but injury still carries the same economic weight. Construction spreads exist, but cities grow as slowly as medieval towns. Magic is treated like a special effect instead of a baseline condition. I can't believe that no mage had the idea of opening up a magical construction business. That selective impact is one of the biggest reasons fantasy economies feel wrong. Magic is strong enough to change history, but conveniently too weak to change jobs. Now add time into the equation. Fantasy worlds are full of long-lived species and individuals who, if you followed real economic behavior, would dominate markets without even trying. Elves who live for centuries, wizards who outlast dynasties, spirits and ancient beings who would remember entire civilizations rising and falling. In real economies, time is one of the strongest advantages you can have. The longer you exist, the more you accumulate. Not just money, but experience, reputation, trust networks, trade secrets, and institutional memory. A merchant operating continuously for 300 years wouldn't just be rich. They would control routes, undercut competitors until they vanished, and shape entire industries around themselves. A noble house led by an immortal wouldn't forget debts or alliances. It wouldn't lose records. Capital wouldn't reset each generation. It would compound permanently. Fantasy settings consistently refuse to let that happen. In Lord of the Rings, elves are ancient and wise, but rarely economic players. In Dragon Age, long-lived beings influence politics and culture, yet markets still behave as if everyone has a human lifespan. In the Elder Scrolls, characters who have lived through multiple eras somehow have encountered industries or turned accumulated knowledge into overwhelming economic leverage. What fantasy does instead is erase compound advantage. Well, I guess it just acts like it doesn't exist. But according to most fantasy media, a long life grants perspective and melancholy, not market power. Memory exists, but it never translates into dominance. It's a deliberate choice to stop time from having consequences. Then there's how fantasy handles production chains. This is where adventurers come back into the picture, but in a more specific way. Adventurers don't just bring back money, they bring back finished goods, fully enchanted weapons, refined rare materials, artifacts that skip every intermediate stage of production. In any normal economy, value is created step by step. Raw materials are extracted, processed, shaped, assembled, improved, and distributed. Each step supports specialists, guilds, apprenticeships, regional expertise, and long-term skill development. Dungeon Looted leads that entire ladder. It turns the full production process into a single violent shortcut. You can see the tension clearly in Skyrim. Crafting exists and is theoretically deep, yet dungeon rewards regularly outperform what most craftsmen could ever produce. In Monster Hunter, the word actually commits to the implication. Entire towns exist purely to serve as hunters. Blacksmiths, traders, and researchers all orbit the people who bring back monster parts. The economy openly admits who the reproducers are. Most fantasy worlds sit uncomfortably between those two approaches. Crafts remains prestigious and stable, even though their economic role no longer makes sense. Blacksmiths should either disappear, specialize entirely around adventurers, or become dependent maintenance providers. Instead, they stay comfortably important, as if nothing changed. That contradiction never resolves, and it reinforces the sense that the economy is being held in place by narrative force. Another fantasy-specific problem shows up when you look at death. In many fantasy settings, death is negotiable. Resurrection spells exist. Healing magic can undo injuries that would permanently remove someone from the workforce. Characters routinely survive situations that would add careers, bloodlines, or entire social classes in the real world. That completely reshapes risk. In a world where injury and death are final, dangerous professions filter people out quickly. Over time, that limits how dominant those professions can become. But once death loses permanence, that filter weakens or disappears. You can see this clearly in World of Warcraft. Death is a temporary convenience. The most dangerous activities are also the most profitable, and the downside is minimal. As a result, high-risk behavior becomes normalized. Adventuring, raiding, monster hunting, they become the most rational economic path, not desperate gambles. Fantasy often wants the emotional tension of danger without letting survivability change behavior. But once people stop permanently dying, society should tilt heavily towards high-risk, high-reward work. That will concentrate wealth, influence, and cultural status around those professions. Ignoring that creates another disconnect between what the world allows and how people would realistically act. Then there's destruction. Fantasy loves destroying cities. Wars, monsters, magical catastrophes, divine punishment. Entire regions get wiped out with surprising regularity. What's missing is what comes afterwards. In real economies, reconstruction reshapes societies for decades. Rebuilding creates massive demand for labor, materials, logistics, and credit. Fortunes are made supplying reconstruction. Entire political factions rise around controlling who rebuilds what, where, and with whose money. Debt taking undoing, rebuilding defines generations. Fantasy skips almost all of this. Infrastructure reappears intact. No one becomes powerful by controlling reconstruction contracts, and no one is crushed under long-term rebuilding costs. The setting resets so the next adventure can take place in familiar streets. By removing reconstruction, fantasy removes one of the strongest forces that normally changes economic hierarchies over time. And that brings us to the bigger picture. Fantasy economies feel weird not because of one mistake, but because they consistently avoid letting consequences stack. Magic boosts productivity, but not labor markets. Long lives exist, but not corporate advantage. Violence generates wealth, but not monopolies. Destruction happens without long-term economic fallout. Death loses weight without changing risk behavior. The economy stays simple, so the story stays readable. And it makes sense, to be honest. But the moment you let these forces actually interact, the genre changes. Adventures become a permanent elite class. Magic education becomes the main economic divide. Long-lived beings dominate markets, cities boom, and decay instead of staying static. Risk becomes the most valuable skill anyone can learn. At that point, the world starts feeling like a neutral backdrop, and it starts feeling like a place that would actually produce winners and losers. So I'll leave you with this. But if you had to live in one of these worlds, what would you actually do for a living once magic starts replacing people? Would you be a classic adventurer, or do you have a more unique plan? Well, let me know, and thanks for watching.